Hello everybody, welcome back to Art of War, Hell Hath No Fury. This is about the 7th time trying to do this today. It hasn't worked so far, but seems as though we're in the 7th week now of lockdown, that's hardly a surprise. I'm going a little bit nuts. But yes, in previous parts we caught up with all the characters who are going to feature in the book and found out what they've been up to and what their goals are. We're going to jump right back in now to chapter 6, which is back in Martha's perspective. So yeah, without further ado, chapter 6. Rebecca Patterson had lived in a modest mid-terrace house opposite the park in the beating heart of the town. From the outside there was no visual indication of the horrors that had occurred within, etched upon the faded brick that made up the lower half of the building, nor could they be found painted on the quaint upper fascia of white painted stone and black timbered beams that intersected to meet at a triangular point on the roof. Quaint, picturesque, as perfect as it had been for centuries. With plenty of neighbours nearby, Martha wondered if any of them had heard the woman being attacked. If they had, not a single of them had run to her rescue or called for help. Nobody had been bothered enough to attempt to save Rebecca from being brutally murdered. Olivia had a theory as to why that might be the case, telling her and Parker, standing between them on the lawn in front of the house. There's a high chance that the victim had the house magically warded with barrier spells. They would have kept it all nice and quiet on the inside, as well as safe from the outside. I have them on my townhouse. They're a godsend. Intrigued by the notion, Martha asked her, "Magical soundproofing?" Olivia smiled rather smugly, amongst many other wonderful perks. "Can you tell if the house is or was warded?" "Not from out here," the magical expert replied, gazing up at the building, as if what she really wanted to do was run far away from it. That was a feeling that Martha could empathise with, because she felt it too. They all felt it, which was why they were still standing out on the lawn. Nothing mystical or magical. Besides, one of them was a null, and the bravest person Martha had ever known. "She let her killer in," she pointed out. "I saw that in my reading. I heard whoever did this ring her doorbell, and she opened the door and let them in." Olivia shrugged. "Shouldn't have made a difference." "What do you mean?" "There are different kinds of protection spells. I have no way of knowing what kinds of incantations that Rebecca Patterson used, but almost all magical warding is innately designed to not only protect the perimeter, but also the person that it's supposed to be keeping safe. If she cast protection spells on her house, they should have kept her safe from harm, regardless of whether or not the threat to her life got inside. Think of it as a pacification bonus." "Say something did get inside," Martha pondered. "What would it take to get past, counter or suppress her protection spells? What could do that?" Olivia didn't seem to need to think hard to answer it. She said, "Power." "Power as in physical or magical strength?" Pagan's astute green eyes still seemed to be searching the outer shell of the building, avidly scrutinizing it for signs of the magic that she was talking about. There was also something else in her stare, a confusion reminiscent of the moment of hesitation she'd displayed back at MPIA. Like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure what, or why it was bothering her so much. Hating herself for having to do it, Martha again urged, "Olivia?" Her friend visibly swallowed. "Yeah, that would do it." Which didn't specifically answer the question that Martha had asked, but was something that she'd feared. Whoever the mysterious blonde woman that had murdered Rebecca Patterson was, she was scary and fierce, clearly capable of overruling the magical protection of an adept witch with the sheer force of her metaphysical power or physicality. Somebody very dangerous. The female Nephilim would be lying if she tried to pretend that she wasn't half expecting the blonde woman to be a demon, perhaps even the demon, the one that she'd been permitted to remain in Marytown to hunt. There were notable similarities, but it was just as likely that she could have been a servant of the demon, or just a powerful magic user, or something else entirely. They needed to be certain. She needed proof, irrefutable evidence of what she suspected, especially if she was going to be working with the investigators from Empire, people that she admired and respected immensely, people who'd already risked their lives for her sister, gave Amanda the truth about her father's tragic death. Martha wouldn't risk their safety because she was gung-ho in her mission to see Marytown liberated, and by proxy all of those who lived in the lands free from the dark influence that had long held them captive. Even though it was clear what kind of monster liked to call this town their playground, she wouldn't make any assumptions about this particular death, not without doing the victim and the wonderfully unselfish woman who'd taken it upon herself to reopen the case a massive disservice. She'd seen with her own empathic eyes how some members of the human police force had originally dealt with the murder, permitted their personal biases to hinder their quest for the truth. She would do better than them. She had to. "Are we ready to head inside?" Martha asked, not sure if she was checking with her companions or herself. The vision that she'd been subjected to during her psychic touch reading of the talisman her stepfather had used to summon his killer had been bad enough, brutal and traumatic to witness. This was different. This was real, where the murder had happened. Without further prompting, Olivia headed through the door, determined to take lead in the investigation, which was more than fair. It had been her idea to look deeper into what had happened to Rebecca Patterson, probably because of her affinity for the magic that she shared with the dead woman. Heaven only knew that if Martha ever encountered a fellow empath that had been slaughtered in such a brutal manner, she might well struggle not to take it the same personal way. Emotionally connecting with someone you're trying to help is not a weakness. Whilst the professional distance is healthy, there's a lot to be said for caring about those in need on a deeper level. Olivia Maxwell cared about Rebecca Patterson, which was a quality that Martha could never ever hold against her. Speaking of caring, Michael Parker followed right behind Olivia as she approached the house. Though Martha suspected he would have been happy to hang back on the lawn for a little while longer, his nerves making her own tingle in empathic recognition, he compartmentalised them, because he cared about his colleague and wanted to protect her, to make sure that she wasn't walking into any danger, for reasons that went beyond doing the job that he'd been brought to do. It was endearing, an unselfish act that made Martha's chest ache in a way that she hated herself for feeling. Those two worked well together. Martha had spent enough time in the company of the MPIA investigators to see that they were a team, a unified force that operated in perfect synchronicity, without the need to communicate their intentions, or without metaphysically tripping all over each other or their own feet. It was remarkable, instinctual, because they knew each other on a level that most people didn't get to know another person, deeply bonded, emotionally, if no longer physically. It wasn't something as simple as love, though there was clearly still a lot of that between the two, despite what Parker might have valiantly tried to make Martha believe, or what Olivia frequently brushed off with playful sarcasm. Love can fade, that was common. It could be cast aside, it could change. The bond between Parker and his former wife was immutable. Something which would always be there, no matter what came between them or how the relationship changed. It didn't take an empath to feel it, to recognise what it meant, but it certainly took someone who cared perhaps a little bit too much to painfully be aware that their personal history and physical connection wasn't limited to the past. Maybe start irrationally comparing it to another relationship, one that it was truly nothing like. Feeling an ache in the palm of her injured hand, Martha looked down to realise with no small amount of annoyance that she'd been cradling it with her other hand, rubbing her thumb along the soft fabric of the handkerchief that bandaged the rough slices that may or may not have already started to heal up, like they'd caused her some discomfort. It didn't hurt now, not really. She could probably remove the binding, her hand didn't need it. Maybe later, she shrugged, returning her gaze to the two investigators who'd breached Rebecca Patterson's house. Olivia had asked for her help. The only thing that mattered was doing the job that she'd been brought along to do, and the job was to investigate why an innocent woman had lost her life in a violent, unprovoked attack. Nothing else mattered. Nothing personal. The front door of Rebecca Patterson's house opened into a cramped square hallway. The flooring was black tile, the kind of material that might have gleamed like a perfect dark mirror when it was immaculately cleaned, but now the only thing it reflected was all of the dirty feet that had trampled over it, leaving behind their prints. Even from where she stood, Martha could feel the trepidation rolling off Olivia as she cautiously stepped in, evidently half expecting some kind of preternatural nasty to pounce on her the moment she entered the building. It didn't happen, but the sensitive pagan still froze, brought her hand up to cover her nose and mouth, and visibly paled, eyes fixed on what lay in the room located off to the right. The living room, scene of the gruesome crime. Martha had a clear enough mental image of the carnage that had been left behind. She didn't need to see it again for herself. Awful, violent images of its inception had bombarded her mind more than once. Death, particularly violent death, left behind a visual shadow that was sometimes impossible to erase, and this one had lingered in her psyche. She couldn't blame Olivia for her hesitation when she wasn't in a rush to go inside of the house either. Proving himself braver or perhaps more hard-headed than the pair of them, Parker stepped into the small hall and leaned around his partner to see what made her hesitate for himself. The way his body shielded Olivia made Martha certain that he would instantly leap at any monster that dared to ambush her. A consummate hero, but that was why he'd been brought along. While neither of the women present would ever claim that they needed to be physically protected by a man, it was a comfort for Olivia to have him there by her side, ready to step in. She stared up beseechingly at him as he grimaced and covered the lower half of his own face in revulsion, seeking for him to be the strong one while she faltered, be her big brave protector. It was one of those looks that said 1,000 tiny things at once in the most fleeting of moments, and yet Martha couldn't help but read every subtle message as if they were scrawled in gaudy flashing neon, and feel all of the heart-wrenching emotions they exposed to her. Not the time, not the place. The investigators shared another moment, a mutual acknowledgement of their horror before turning their faces at the same time to search out the third member of their expedition. Martha made sure to make her face as blank as it could be. There was no need to add her trepidation to all of the potent emotions that were already being laid bare by the situation. She was not too proud to be afraid of what might linger inside of the house, nor so stubborn that she would just saunter in and over the threshold, demand that it hand over the monster responsible for defiling it. She respected the danger it posed, but she was not going to let it show. Bravery could be damned, but cowering nervously outside the house was not a solution. They needed to get to work, find the fortitude to proceed. Stepping forward, she found her voice, asked, "Where do you want me?" Sounding and looking surprised, Olivia blew out a long, shaky stream of air before she wisely replied, "I get the feeling you've seen more enough of that lounge to last a lifetime. So if you'd like to head upstairs, that would be great. I can handle what's down here." Martha nodded. "If you think that's what's for the best." Parker looked like he was still trying not to throw up. "I want to try and find things that might give us more insights into who Rebecca was and why she was targeted. We know that she kept her altar in the lounge, presumably with records of her business and personal effects. It's a good idea." Struggling to find his voice, Parker asked, "What about me?" "There's less blood in the kitchen," Olivia attempted to assure him, astutely pinpointing what she thought might be the issue. "I don't know if she stored anything in there that might be relevant, but it might be worth having a nose around, see if you can find anything that the police might easily overlook." But Parker nodded, he countered, "It's not the blood, it reeks." "Ah," she grimaced, and nodded understanding. Glumly frowning, he said, "God, it's awful." "Open up the windows," Martha interjected firmly, trying and failing in her resolution to not feel like an outsider next to the two of them. "Air the place out. Lord knows it could probably use it." Nodding bluntly, Parker conceded, "Yeah." Martha tried not to worry about the pallor of his usually olive skin. His cool eyes were watering as he glanced in her direction, but he didn't give her the weight of his attention, as if he didn't like her witnessing his struggle to keep it together. Stubborn, stupid. She was never going to judge him. Moving her hand, Olivia began to fumble around in one of the pockets of her coat, pursed her lips and said, "If it's any consolation, I can't sense any sort of magic lingering in here. Nothing that we might need to worry about. If Rebecca had any warning, it's been dead for weeks. The building feels cold and empty, as if there was never any magic conjured here." Retrieving a small, round, metallic tin, she made a satisfied hum and then continued saying, "I want to piece her altar back together. It'll give me some insight into the type of magic that she was using and how she might have cast it." Martha found herself nodding following the thought process, and without her power lingering around, that should be much safer. Olivia shrugged, tinges of anger narrowing her eyes. Her voice was a hell of a bitter pill as she declared, "It's such a personal thing, building an altar." It was Parker that verbally reproached her, saying, "Just be careful." She scoffed, smirked ever so slightly. "I've done this before." She most likely had. She was far from being a novice. Still, her ex-husband replied, "Yeah, that's what worries me." Martha guessed, however, that it hadn't been a throwaway warning on behalf of Parker's concern for her safety. There was so much history between the two of them that she hadn't been standing right there to witness, professional as well as personal. Empire's Null might not be able to physically interact with the power his former wife adeptly manipulated for their agency, but he had to have been there to witness the effects of her mastery, and wasn't about to blindly trust in her determination that a house filled with dried blood and the stench of murder was safe for her to magically tinker about in. Paranoia, perhaps, but it felt like the caution had been earned. With a soft smile, Olivia reached out and pressed the item that she'd taken from her pocket into the palm of Parker's hand, hinting at what it could be with a wry yet seemingly sincere, "For your tummy. Don't throw up." Parker didn't glance down at the gift to see what it was. Instead, he closed his hand around Olivia's smaller one, pulling it ever so slightly as she did so at the same time, and tried... Oh, hang on. Pulling it ever so slightly as she, at the same time, tried to take it back from him, giving Martha the awkward feeling that she was once again witnessing some kind of personal back and forth between the two paranormal investigators that she didn't understand, one that she wasn't a part of. Whatever the whole point of the exchange was, Parker ended up winning and keeping the item. He curled his hands around it as if the simple act of holding on to it made him feel better, and Olivia didn't seem to mind the loss, gazing up at him in a way that made Martha feel much too relieved when a jaunty whistle sang out from somewhere over to her left. She turned her head in the direction it had come from, to locate a middle-aged lady standing on the doorstep of a house 2 doors down the terrace, smiling and waving so emphatically that it was a wonder she didn't topple off the stoop and into the street with the effort. The woman, resplendent with wiry red hair and heavily lipstick-smeared smile, was abuzz with inquisitiveness, and whilst Martha had never been a fan of nosy neighbours, she found herself tempted to rush on over there and give her a massive hug, willingly sacrifice her to the swarm of emotional biting insects that metaphorically made up the woman's empathic aura, if only to escape being continually whacked over the head by the personal baggage that she seemed to be dragging around with her that day. Give herself a break. Tempting as it was, she stayed right where she stood. She wasn't much of a people person, but she knew somebody that seemed to need the distraction, maybe more than he was brave enough to admit. "There you go, Parker," she said, waving her hand at the woman in brisk acknowledgement that she could, in fact, see her. "A neighbour for you to make friends with. That should keep you away from the stench." Martha couldn't tell if he looked relieved or burdened by the option to get far away from the Patterson house, but he shrugged his shoulders, threw Olivia what appeared to be a rather self-satisfied smirk, and re-emerged from the door, making the red-headed pensioner's eyes go wide with delight to see what her wild gesticulating arm had earned her. Oh my, how lucky. She had no idea what was about to hit her. Whilst Michael Parker was certainly easy on the eyes and undeniably the most personable of the three people present, there were other reasons that it was usually him sent to talk to potential witnesses. As shrewd as he could be disarming, he'd learned how to get people to open up to him in a way that made them think it was all their idea. If a nosy neighbour knew anything worth knowing about the night that Rebecca Patterson had been killed, he'd gracefully coax it out of her. Those lovely baby blues of his, were hardly a disadvantage either. By the time Parker reached the next house along, Olivia had poked her blonde head out of the doorway to watch him go, sufficiently amused by the turn of events. She and Martha watched as he was quickly greeted and cordially invited to go inside of the neighbour's house, likely for a lovely spot of tea and some biscuits. Nice for some. Olivia shrugged. Rather him than me. "I hear you," Martha agreed with much levity. "Let's hope we don't need him inside." Fingers crossed. Drawing in another deep breath, the blonde pagan nodded and then turned towards the door of the desecrated living room and sauntered inside as if she carried all the confidence in the world inside of her heeled boots, an act she didn't usually seem to have to fake. It felt far removed from the super-confident woman that had strode into the study of Martha's late stepfather and playfully teased Parker, simply because she'd instinctually known how awkward the moment must have been for him, before taking control of the chaotic scene lay out for her perusal with a steady professionalism that had been inspiring. Olivia was taking Rebecca Patterson's death personally. That much was obvious to anybody who'd spoken to her as of late, but it seemed like there was more going on beneath the surface. Martha wasn't sure what she could do to help, or if it was even her place to offer such assistance. The two of them were friends, to a certain extent, but the person who connected them was in a house down the street, and there didn't seem to be much more than professional interest in seeing Rebecca's killer brought to justice, giving them anything more in common that day. Olivia hadn't seemed to want to talk further, and it wasn't Martha's business to push the issue. Not really. Left to her own devices, hovering outside Rebecca Patterson's front door, the female Nephilim decided to stop dwelling on things that she might not be able to fix and concentrated on what she could inside of that house. She just had to be brave enough to go through the door, which she finally did with an extremely bated breath. A narrow staircase led up, directly opposite the entrance. It felt ridiculous to admit, but Martha felt almost as reluctant to climb it as she was afraid of what was inside of the room that Olivia had eventually been brave enough to penetrate. Rather than an aversion to the things she knew could potentially overwhelm her, because it had done so already, it was a fear of the unknown, which was natural, and had never stopped her once before. Leaving the front door open because Parker hadn't been exaggerating about the smell that had permeated through the whole house, she began to climb the stairs. Her hand instinctively went to the sheathed blade affixed to her belt at the small of her back. A gesture of comfort she'd reached for far too many times already one day. While she felt like she ought to have been scanning the upper hallway for a potential of an ambush, she found herself nervously watching her footing, wary of stumbling over her own feet again. Let it not be said she couldn't learn from her mistakes. Her ankle was still more than a little bit achy from her earlier fall, and she didn't want to risk making it worse. Maybe she should have been less stubborn and let Stefan check that she hadn't actually done some real damage to it. But it was a little bit too late for that now. She was where she was, and he was where he was, and that was perfectly fine. She didn't need to be babysat anymore, though the distance between the two of them felt immense, further and more vast than it had ever felt before. The carpet on the stairs was grey and worn down, so threadbare that some of the flooring boards beneath had started to visibly poke through the gaps. No roots nor branches to trip over, but it was unfamiliar ground, and there was no handrail fixed to the bare off-white wall to her left-hand flank. About halfway up the staircase there was a decent-sized window, but with no obvious way of opening it or any personalised touches or ornaments on the sill. Martha pressed forward. Nothing to see there, not even a nice pair of curtains. Stark contrast to what greeted her when she reached the top. Nestled into the immediate end of the hallway where a small bathroom had presumably once been, given the frosted glass of the window that was hanging there, Rebecca Patterson had created what appeared to be a reading nook. Cosy, compact. A sumptuous armchair nestled in the middle of two towering stacks of books, a patchwork knitted blanket and a purple cushion scattered over its seat. The books were all weathered, all hardcover, different shapes and sizes, but they seemed to have come together to form a perfectly haphazard collection, and it appeared as though the owner had been stacked them up to use as end tables. A dainty china tea set remained sitting on top of one of the stacks, sadly never to be used again, a moment captured in time. At first it seemed a strange place to choose to relax and read, but when she turned her head, Martha saw that the armchair had been angled in such a way as to take full advantage of the huge arching window at the far end of the hall, and the spectacular view it captured of the north side of Marytown Park, which was located directly across the street from the house. A perch from which Rebecca would have been able to pause, watch the world go by, watch squirrels rush about the place, moving from tree to tree, searching for the best acorns to take away and plant in a spot they'd likely forget the location of soon after. She would have been able to watch the sunrise while she sipped tea from her small china teacup, and saw all the people who visited the park perhaps ponder their histories, their life stories, their curious motivations, observed from a comfortable distance. While Rebecca wouldn't have been living there when Martha used to be one of those strangers, a young tomboy who spent far too much time playing in the park, the gifted empath suddenly felt as though their paths ought to have crossed, that their lives should have touched each other's long before they had. Sitting down in the armchair, she felt inexplicably close to the dead woman, and was glad that Rebecca's life had perhaps not been quite as tragic as her lonely death might have made it seem. It was an unusual way to live, given the innate human drive to seek others, crave companionship, love, but it didn't have to be negative. Martha understood her enjoyment of the small luxuries that she had in her life, and the comprehension that being alone didn't always mean that you had to be lonely. There was a lot to be said for the peace that one can find when you simply spend some time by yourself, with your thoughts, reading a book, sipping tea, or watching the world go by through a window, a distinct line between isolation and sanctuary. Rebecca had seemed happy with her little world, content to shut out the rest and simply read a book. It was a nice thought, for she'd been through a lot in life. It was good that the difficulties that she'd needed to overcome had not broken but shaped her. The act of leaving behind a home to start a new and hopefully better life somewhere completely different, only to experience the pain of losing the person she loved in a sudden and tragic accident as they'd only just been starting out, hadn't left her bitter and lost. Fate had been unkind to this poor woman, but she had carved out a place within it and had been able to find some moments of true peace. An existence that perhaps nourished her soul, kept her going. That was a blessing, but it also made her death all the more awful. The reality that this peace had been spoiled, this sanctuary desecrated. Martha could understand Olivia's drive to see whoever did this horrific thing to Rebecca Patterson pay. It was evil whichever way you looked at it. Rising back to her feet, she left the reading nook behind and carried on exploring the second floor of the dead woman's home. The rear bedroom had been converted into a large and opulent bathroom, presumably so that Rebecca had more space in which to pamper herself. Instead, inside it boasted a freestanding white tub with very ornate golden clawed feet, a wide built-in shower cubicle, a deep washing basin which was slotted into an elegant side unit, and a toilet that was far too pretty for its intended use. The window was covered in black shut-out blinds rolled down, waiting to be used again, and the shelves and units were crammed full of old-fashioned bottles, containing beautifying potions and lotions, and big pillar candles of various shapes and sizes. As lovely and as tempting as it looked, Martha resisted the urge to go in and clamber into the bathtub, or investigate the room any further. If Rebecca had used the room for anything other than a bathroom, performing magical spells or committing ritual sacrifices in there, Martha couldn't see any visual evidence of it. To her, the room was another luxurious spot within the home-proud witch's sanctuary, lovely, unspoiled, which felt like a small blessing that was now a tragic memory. Shutting the door, Martha carried on up the landing. It felt like, the grave sin that the crime scene investigators must have stomped through this house, seeking clues as to why someone murdered the woman who lived there, without care to stop, slow down, see the beauty of it all. Especially when the police had gone on to seemingly decide that the crime wasn't worth their time, because the victim had either been a known witch who sold her talents for money, like those persecuted and much feared harlots of old, or perhaps because she was an immigrant, with no close relatives to push them for answers. It was hard to tell which of those potential labels angered Martha more. As a card-carrying member of the other club, she felt deeply offended on Rebecca Patterson's behalf, and was grateful she had souls in her life that she knew would turn over all heaven and earth to find out what happened to her, should the worst ever come to pass. People that she knew wouldn't rest until she was avenged, until her killer was found and had paid their dues. In life, Rebecca Patterson had made the most of being alone, but in death that solitude seemed to have cost her dearly, and that was a crime that Martha was hoping to be able to correct. The human authorities might not have cared that somebody who dallied in the dark arts had met an untimely end, but Martha wasn't human. Well, not exactly human. All she needed was an opportunity to help this woman now. The final room upstairs was located at the front of the house, next to the big park-facing window. By process of elimination, Martha deduced that it must have been the bedroom, Rebecca's most private, most personal space, the potential true haven within her sanctuary of many such spots. Taking a deep breath, she carefully inched the door open, prepared to face whatever was waiting for her inside. Okay, so that is chapter 6 of today's. It's just, it was quite a small chapter, even though it took me half an hour to read it. Martha, Parker and Olivia have set about entering Rebecca Patterson's house to see and find out what happened to her. There will be more from that in later chapters as we carry on. I don't want to really say much more than that. I'm just going to let that stand for itself, and as we carry on, things will, open up and become more clear, and I can probably discuss a few more things later down the line. But at the moment, we're just starting out. There is Olivia is questioning the lack of or potential warding on the house. Martha seems to be tripping over her own personal baggage a little bit too much for one day, and finding some common ground and something to empathise with the dead woman. So as always, thank you for watching. That was chapter 6. We'll be moving on with chapter 7 tomorrow. Hopefully, fingers crossed, everything going well. I hope you all have a good day, a good Monday. As I said, 7 weeks into this isolation. It is for my family because we went into quarantine, into lockdown before the official lockdown dropped. So we're now on to week 7. I hope that everybody is doing okay and finding ways to cope and to distract yourself. Fingers crossed it shouldn't be too much longer. Okay, so have a good day. Take care. Bye now.